Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. Alright, book 2 of the Herald Spy trilogy. So last week we, of course, did the first book. The thing about this one, we're still on the story of Mags, is that this series is really picking up that whole what happens after you graduate and move on in an odd way, in a very odd sort of way. You could say that this series is echoing Mercedes Lackey's first trilogy. And by series, I'm not talking about just the Herald Spy one. I'm talking about all 3 of the Herald Mags series, because you have the first, the Collegium Chronicles, then you have the Herald Spy trilogy, and then you have the Hills Have Spies trilogy, which follows this, which I may or may not do because I haven't actually read it yet, so I'll have to decide at some point whether I want to do it, because, like I said way back when, my policy on this is books that I have already read that I liked. That is, I decide whether or not I'm going to do it based on knowing in advance whether or not I liked the book to begin with, not artificially deciding to do this, which is why some of the series that I do may not be completed, precisely because I will not have read every book in a series, or I will not have liked every book in a series, and will therefore be just skipping right past them. Anyhow, I can't comment whether or not I'd like The Hills Have Spies, precisely because I have not actually read them yet. So, the thing is, though, that how this echoes the first series, the Arrows trilogy, which was just 3 books, is that the Collegium Chronicles kind of echo, in most ways, they kind of echo the first book in the Arrows trilogy, The Arrows of the Queen, which is where Talia gets chosen and gets her training and is at the Collegium learning how to be a herald. Book 2, now, book 2 is Talia's time on circuit, learning how to be a herald, sort of out and about, but it's very much about what happens after you graduate, after you start to sort of get your real world life experience. And the third in this, which is going to be The Hills Have Spies, it does kind of pick up, again, it's not a one-to-one thing, but that picks up after Mags and Amelie have been married for a long time. In the Arrows trilogy, what happens is that that's very much about Talia after she graduates, after she learns about being a herald, after she's settled into her being an adult, being confident, knowing what she's doing, and having confidence in her ability to make good choices, etc., etc. So, these books, in a very odd way, these 3 series of books reflect the first 3 books that ever were written in the Valdemar series. But those books are a long way off, so if you haven't read them, I really do recommend reading the Valdemar series in order of publication, because I always recommend reading a series in the order of publication. The Arrows trilogy isn't the best series of books in the series, but it's the one that established the whole universe. And there's something to be said for following a universe from its first establishment in order of sort of developments, so that you can sort of track how things are going. By doing this in chronological order, you're having a very different sort of perspective on it. Because it is a very different perspective, after all, to read some of these books knowing what you know from the far distant future. It's a very different perspective. In any event, you can read books in whatever order you want, and some of these are so far separate from other books that it can be worth just not really worrying about it. I mean, the Griffin trilogy is happening so far off from everything else, it might as well be its own separate world. In any event, so closer to the heart is we now have Emily is getting settled into her role as King's Own. This, in fact, takes all 3 books in the series for her to sort of really settle into it, which is understandable, both because it takes time to settle into a new job of such high import as being the king's centralmost and most important advisor, but also because her father is still there and he was the King's Own and he's still a working herald, and it's an idea that doesn't really kick in until the 3rd book, but this idea of everybody constantly looking at him even though she's the one who's officially the King's Own, well, it's a little bit off-putting. So in this particular one, they get word that there's been a sort of a coup d'etat, or they're working up to a coup d'etat in the adjoining country of Menmelith, and that in that country they have a young regent, they have a young king, but it's one of those, he's 10 years old, he still needs a regent, and the country is effectively, in practical terms, being run by a council, and some man off in the south of Menmelith is trying to effectively take over and become king because he feels that a 10-year-old shouldn't be king in the meanwhile. Anyhow, so somehow someone has been receiving weapons from, at least ostensibly from, Valdemar, and the Menmelith ambassador comes running straight to Valdemar saying, okay, something's going on and they're going to try, they may well declare war on you, which is, after all, hugely problematic, especially because they have not, in fact, or at least their government has not been shipping weapons. So Mags and Emily have to split up, despite the fact that they were sort of going to be having a very massive public wedding ceremony, which the king had wanted a massive public wedding ceremony for various political purposes. In the course of Closer to the Heart, the two of them, they do quietly more or less elope so that they can have a wedding and be married and be certain that they are in fact married, and they just have a big public wedding later on, but this way, they're married and it's done and it doesn't matter what interruptions happen, they've been married. Mags, in the meanwhile, is building up his spy network of various people in Haven, because, of course, his job as one of the spy masters, or the apprentice spy master to the king, because he's still learning his craft, obviously, but one of the things he's having to do is to build up his spy network. So he's got his messenger boys, who are street children that he sort of takes in and gives them training to first be messengers and then get them placed in various spots. And it makes him feel very good because he's paying forward all of the help he got from the heralds rescuing him from the mines, helping all of these kids basically get better lives. In the meantime, he gets a very faithful spy network. Emily is building an information network because when you are a political creature like a king's advisor in a situation that is sort of a pseudo-medieval place, you're going to need information and you're going to need informants, and she sets up a bunch of informants who are, among other things, able to be set up as sort of ladies' maids, because, of course, younger daughters in most medieval, pseudo-medieval, fantasy, whatever societies, younger daughters very rarely are able to make advantageous marriages. Their parents don't have the money for a dowry for more than the eldest daughter. And so you tend, historically, and of course in Valdemar, these are women who don't have training in any sort of practical craft, because noble women don't get trained in that kind of thing, and who don't want to become priestesses or nuns or whatever. And so Amelie recruits them. Anyways, this whole book is very much about Mags and Amelie basically learning the craft. I mean, it is, of course, also about unraveling the mystery of who's sending all of these men out and discovering that there's some guy who has somehow managed to convince himself that he should be the power behind the throne, and that Valdemar should make itself better by conquering the next countries over. Very ambitious, doesn't want to be king himself because, of course, once you're king yourself, the buck stops with you, whereas if you are the Grand Vizier hiding behind the throne, the buck stops with the king, which means it can go right past you because, you're not actually the official decision maker. But, this is... I do not use the word coming of age because, frankly, coming of age is always a very appalling phrase to me. But this is very much about learning how to handle their jobs and learning how to handle these positions that neither of them expected. With Amelie in the last book, she becomes King's Own out of the blue, and this book is really very much about her just genuinely learning how to do the job, while Mags is, he's further developing his craft as a spy and learning from the man who taught Nicholas everything he knows. And, it's the middle of the series, and it's very much about the two of them establishing themselves. And establishing themselves not just, to people outside, but sort of in their own heads as who they are. And as what they are, that is King's Own and eventual King Spymaster. And honestly, I don't have a lot else to say unless you want me to give you a blow-by-blow of the plot of the book. But I'm fairly certain nobody really does, so I'm going to cut this off, and I will get on with the last book in the series next week.